Geographically speaking, it might surprise you to hear that Kazakhstan is the 9th largest country in the world. It's a huge place that's roughly the same size as the whole of Western Europe, stretching from Portugal to Poland. And if it were placed over the continental United States, Kazakhstan's landmass would sprawl from San Diego in the southwest to St. Louis in the east. But despite this impressive geographic size, Kazakhstan is also one of the emptiest locations on the entire planet as well. Whereas Western Europe is home to more than 400 million people today, Kazakhstan just recently hit the population milestone of only 20 million people this year in 2024. Which, for reference, is fewer people than live in the US state of Florida, spread out across an area that is about exactly 16 times larger than Florida is. This overall gives Kazakhstan one of the absolute lowest population densities of any location on the planet today, at just over 7 people per square kilometer on average. The 11th lowest density of people of all the countries in the world, and notably, the 2nd most sparsely populated country that's located anywhere within Eurasia, remaining only behind the emptiest country in the world of all, Mongolia. But what's even stranger at first glance about Kazakhstan's demographic pattern is that it appears to be a sort of population void in the center of the Eurasian continent. Literally every piece of land that surrounds Kazakhstan on all of its sides has a much denser population than Kazakhstan itself has. Whether it's Russia to the north and the west, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan to the south, or China's Xinjiang province to the east. Kazakhstan is surrounded by other lands that are much more densely populated than it, in a pattern that resembles more well-known inhospitable climates like the Tibetan Plateau, the Sahara Desert, or the Amazon rainforest. Despite its huge geographic size, Kazakhstan doesn't even have the largest population in Central Asia, with Uzbekistan having nearly twice the number of people, despite having only 1/6 of the available land that is similarly landlocked and largely dominated by the same climate types as Kazakhstan. Of course, a great deal of Kazakhstan's relative emptiness can easily be explained by much of the country's intensely harsh climate and hostile environment. Kazakhstan is the biggest landlocked country in the world that is thousands of kilometers away from any ocean. And so, with only limited large bodies of water nearby like the Caspian Sea to regulate the area's climate, Kazakhstan's climate is one of the most varied and wild in the world, with bitterly cold winters and hot summers. Practically the entire country's landmass is dominated by either a cold desert climate across the center, or a dry semi-arid climate across the north and the east of the country that resembles conditions seen in southern Ukraine or the American Great Plains region running from West Texas to North Dakota, with only scattered pockets of more easily livable climates. But nonetheless, due to its sheer size, Kazakhstan still has a large amount of arable land and renewable freshwater resources that would normally be conducive to a much larger population than just 20 million people. Nearly 11% of Kazakhstan's huge land area is considered arable and suitable for agriculture, largely across the belt of prairie in the north of the country that encompasses Kazakhstan's portion of the Great Eurasian Steppe. Kazakhstan has about 296,697 square kilometers worth of arable land in total, which is not only larger than the entire land area of the United Kingdom, but is the 11th highest amount of arable land of any country in the entire world. To put this into perspective, Kazakhstan has more agricultural land available than tons of other countries around the world that have much larger populations than it, like Indonesia, Turkey, Pakistan, or France, and many others. In fact, Kazakhstan is such a major outlier here that it is by far the country with the highest density of arable land per person in the entire world, with an average of 15,456 square meters of arable land available per person in the country. The closest competitors to Kazakhstan's arable land density are Australia, Canada, and Argentina, which also, notably, all have significantly higher populations than Kazakhstan has. In terms of other countries that have well-known sparse populations like Mongolia, Namibia, or Libya, Kazakhstan has vastly more available arable land than any of them do, while Kazakhstan also has vastly more available renewable water resources as well. Kazakhstan has about 108 billion cubic meters worth of total renewable water resources per year, which again outclasses many other countries that have much larger populations than Kazakhstan has, like Tanzania, Iraq, Ivory Coast, South Korea, or Afghanistan. Kazakhstan has one very significant river, the Syr Darya, that's fed from glacial snowmelt from the high Tian Shan mountain range to the east in Kyrgyzstan that used to empty into the huge Aral Sea, while the country also fully encompasses Lake Balkhash, the 15th largest lake by surface area in the world, and there are tons of smaller, more minor rivers dotted across the country as well. Kazakhstan's population density today largely follows where the fresh water is located, like along the banks of the Syr-Darya River. But still, Kazakhstan has enough arable land and enough fresh water despite its largely arid and cold climate that you would expect it would have a population greater than just the 20 million people that it currently has today. And indeed, it probably would be a lot more densely populated of a place today, were it not also for the fact that Kazakhstan has had its natural geography more negatively altered by mankind than perhaps any other physical location on the surface of the Earth. Because a very great deal of what makes Kazakhstan so sparsely populated today in the center of Eurasia, despite its huge amounts of arable land and freshwater, is the simple fact that the 20th century was an unmitigated, continuous catastrophe for the country in just about every way imaginable. And the Kazakhstan of today in 2024 is still trying and struggling to play demographic and geographic catch-up with the consequences of a century-long handicap that most other countries in the world today simply don't have to deal with. Allow me to explain. The idea of Kazakhstan was born in the later 15th century in 1465 with the first emergence of the Kazakh Khanate, a nomadic steppe empire that for centuries sprawled across the central Eurasian steppe, from the Caspian Sea in the west to the Tian Shan Mountains in the east. As the Tsardom of Russia coalesced around its core in Muscovy around the same time, it began expanding in search of more geographically defensible terrain in every direction. And that Russian quest for more geographically defensible borders eventually brought them to the frontier of the Kazakh steppe by the 1600s. The old frontier between the settled Russian society and the nomadic Kazakh society roughly followed the geographic boundary in Eurasia between the forest of the north and the treeless steppe of the south. And to prevent nomadic raids from the steppe overflowing into Russia that had been commonplace for centuries, and to protect their own overland trade route going into China, the Russians began constructing a series of forts along this geographic frontier between the Caspian Sea and the Tian Shan Mountains across the 17th and 18th centuries that represented the beginning of the Russian settlement of modern-day Kazakhstan. Many of these 17th and 18th century forts developed into major modern cities of the 21st century today, and many of them built and initially settled by the Russians are today found across the border in Kazakhstan rather than Russia. Then, mostly across the second half of the 19th century, the Russian Empire rapidly expanded its area of control across Central Asia through military conquest. And in order to maintain their control over these newly conquered territories, the Russian Empire began encouraging a massive settlement program of ethnic Russians and Ukrainians to colonize Kazakhstan and the rest of Central Asia to shift the region's demographics to become more Slavic. Hundreds of thousands of the Russian Empire Slavs from Eastern Europe began settling in Kazakhstan in the late 19th century, and they began coming in even higher droves after the Russians finished constructing the Trans-Aral Railway in 1906, which for the first time connected the lands of Kazakhstan and Central Asia directly with European Russia by rail. Russians and Ukrainians were especially encouraged by the Tsarist authorities to settle the fertile arable lands of northern Kazakhstan, and by the time of the Russian Empire's first census that was conducted in 1897, a total of 454,000 Russians had already settled in modern-day Kazakhstan, and they made up about 11% of the total population. At the time, ethnic Kazakhs still made up a significant majority in Kazakhstan with about 3.4 million people, and about 83% of the territory's total population. But as the 19th century passed into the 20th century, that balance wouldn't last for very long, as Kazakhstan would go through multiple decades of catastrophic demographic collapse, triggered directly by the policies of Tsarist and later Soviet authorities. The increasing settlement of sedentary Russians and Ukrainians in Kazakhstan clashed with the traditional culture of the indigenous nomadic Kazakhs, and resentment among the Kazakhs mounted for decades until they exploded in outright revolt in 1916, when the Tsarist regime began attempting to conscript Muslim Kazakhs to fight on the Eastern Front during the First World War. The Tsarist regime in Russia chose to put down the 1916 revolt in Central Asia extremely harshly, and in only a matter of months by February of 1917, it's estimated that somewhere between 100,000 and 270,000, mostly Kyrgyz and Kazakh people, were killed as a result of the ensuing violence, famine, and disease, while hundreds of thousands of other Kazakhs fled the chaos into neighboring China, which gave birth to the modern Kazakh diaspora. And then, after the entire Russian Empire collapsed later on in 1917, and the Russian Civil War began between the Communists and the White Movement, Kazakhstan was thrown into an even deeper period of chaos. As the civil war between the Bolsheviks and the Whites intensified across the former empire, catastrophic famine conditions developed across large parts of it that particularly affected Kazakhstan between 1917 and 1922. This first Great Famine is believed to have killed anywhere from 400,000 to 750,000 more people across Kazakhstan over just those 5 years, which is believed to have even further wiped out roughly 10% to 19% of the entire pre-famine ethnic Kazakh population, which obviously resulted in a devastating demographic setback for Kazakhstan. These events, combined with the continued settlement of Russians and Ukrainians in Kazakhstan, led to a severe altering in Kazakhstan's demographics by the time of the next census in the territory that was conducted by the Soviets in 1926. By then, the Kazakhs had shrunk to only 58.5% of the total population, down from the 83% they had once enjoyed 3 decades previously back in 1897, while over the same time period the Russian population in Kazakhstan had more than doubled to become about 21% of the population, while the Ukrainians had also grown to become about 14% of the population. Kazakhstan enjoyed a brief era of autonomy during the Russian Civil War era, before it was subsumed by the Red Army into the newly established Soviet Union by the end of 1922, where it at first became a formal territorial part of the Russian Soviet Republic. For the first 13 years of the Soviet Union's existence up until 1936, Kazakhstan in its entirety remained a legal territory of Russia's within the Soviet Union. And Kazakhstan wasn't legally separated from Russia to become its own separate full Union Soviet Republic until 1936. During those 13 years that Kazakhstan was directly a part of Russia, the Soviet authorities immediately introduced the policy of collective farming to the territory that set up collective farms that were primarily inhabited by Russian and Soviet deportees from elsewhere, rather than by ethnic Kazakhs. After Stalin drafted the Soviet Union's first 5-year plan in 1928, the Bolshevik Kazakh Central Committee officially decreed in 1930 that in order to meet the plan's ambitious agricultural and industrial targets, the entire nomadic Kazakh population would be forcefully sedentarized and incorporated into Kazakhstan's system of collectivized farms. This policy virtually overnight forced Kazakh herders who had lived a nomadic lifestyle across the steppes, with a diet based on their livestock's meat and dairy for literally thousands of years, to immediately abandon everything they and their culture knew and adopt a new life as farmers producing grain instead, which led to what should have been predictably disastrous results. Wealthier Kazakh nomads with larger cattle herds were branded as class enemies, and were forced to hand over large numbers of their cattle at gunpoint, while the increasing numbers of collective farms that were established across the country's steppe resulted in a simultaneous sharp decline in the amount of adequate grazing land available in the country for all of the remaining herds. Between 1930 and 1931, it's estimated that Soviet authorities seized at least 1/3 of Kazakhstan's grain and cereals, and another 1/3 of Kazakhstan's livestock to provide food for the major urban areas in the country, like Moscow and Leningrad, all as Kazakhstan's agricultural output simultaneously plummeted because of the forced collectivization policies. This all ultimately led to one of the most catastrophic man-made famines in human history developing within Kazakhstan and other areas of the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, while Stalin's policies throughout the famine only ended up making things even worse. Districts that the Soviets established within Kazakhstan that didn't meet the government's grain production quotas were blacklisted by Soviet authorities, which meant that they became prohibited from trading with any other districts or villages, which essentially entrapped desperate and starving Kazakhs in blacklisted villages into what effectively became vast zones of death and hunger, where it was physically impossible for anyone to locate any food. In total, in only 3 years between 1930 and 1933, it's estimated that anywhere from 1.5 million to 2.3 million people within Soviet Kazakhstan died as a result of the catastrophic famine, including at least 1.3 million ethnic Kazakhs. It is the sharpest population decline in Kazakhstan's entire history, as it's believed that as much as 42% of the entire pre-famine ethnic Kazakh population of 1929 died, while much of Kazakhstan's ethnic minorities were also affected like Ukrainians, who also lost roughly 36% of their entire pre-famine population in Kazakhstan during the same famine as well. And due to the horrendous severity of the famine during those years, it's also estimated that another roughly 665,000 to 1.1 million more Kazakhs simply fled the country with hundreds of thousands of their cattle into neighboring countries like China, Mongolia, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and the other Soviet Central Asian republics that increased the size of the Kazakh diaspora and exacerbated the food scarcity and the famine in Kazakhstan even further. All of the Kazakhs who attempted to escape from the country during the famine were branded by the Soviet authorities as class traitors, and orders were given to soldiers to shoot them on sight at the border. Thousands of Kazakhs who attempted to escape into China were shot and killed in this way by Soviet border guards as well. And the combined calamity of all the deaths and the refugees caused by the famine led to a rapid decline in the population of Kazakhs in Kazakhstan from nearly 60% of the population before the famine to just 38% of the population afterwards. The two Soviet censuses conducted before and after the famine in 1926 and 1937 revealed that the number of Kazakhs in Kazakhstan crashed from 3,636,612 in 1926 to just 2,181,000 a decade later. And in addition to the previous severe Kazakh famine of 1919 to 1922, Kazakhstan lost more than half of its entire population in a mere 15-year time span due to the actions and policies of the Tsarist and Soviet authorities in the territory. Ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan for the first time outnumbered ethnic Kazakhs, and Kazakhs would remain an ethnic minority in their own republic for decades until after the collapse of the Soviet Union itself in the 1990s. And throughout World War II, Stalin continued meddling with Kazakhstan's demographics even further that would leave behind decades of lasting influence into the modern day. In 1941, after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin had the entire population of 600,000 Volga Germans in Russia forcibly expelled from their homeland and exiled, with more than 400,000 of them getting deported into Kazakhstan, which introduced a large ethnic German minority to Kazakhstan in the process. By 1959, Germans reached more than 7% of Kazakhstan's total population as a result. And by 1989, the German population in Kazakhstan reached nearly 1 million people. Later on in 1944, after the Soviets retook the Crimean Peninsula from the Germans, Stalin also ordered the forcible deportation of the entire ethnic Crimean Tatar population to Central Asia as well, on charges that they had allegedly all collaborated with the Nazi invaders. This introduced a large Tatar ethnic minority into Kazakhstan as well, who eventually numbered several 100,000 people too. And at the same time as all of these outside populations were being transferred to Kazakhstan, more of Kazakhstan's indigenous population was dying during the Second World War as well. The Kazakh Soviet Republic lost a total of 660,000 of its citizens during World War II from 1941 to 1945. Representing another devastating loss of 10.7% of Kazakhstan's total population in only 4 years of war, coming right on the heels of the devastating demographic collapses of the two previous famines in the 1930s and the 1920s as well. As a result of all of this chaos in Kazakhstan, the next Soviet census in the territory conducted in 1959 revealed that ethnic Kazakhs had plummeted to only 30% of Kazakhstan's total population by then, while Russians made up the new majority at 42.7% of the total population, while Ukrainians stood at another 8.2% and Germans at another 7.1% of the total population, giving European ethnicities in Kazakhstan a combined share of about 58% of Kazakhstan's total population at the time. Kazakhstan had, in every sense of the word, been firmly and ruthlessly colonized by Europeans by the middle of the 20th century. And for the rest of the Soviet era in the country, Europeans would retain their overall ethnic majority. Even as late as the 1989 census in the country, the total ethnic European population of Kazakhstan remained at a slight majority of 50.9% of the overall population. Kazakhstan therefore became a unique Soviet republic in the sense that it was the only one where the people it was named after, the Kazakhs, became an ethnic minority within for decades. And it was the only one outside of the Russian Soviet Republic itself where ethnic Russians were a demographic majority for decades, which effectively made Kazakhstan a demographic, if not legal, extension of Russia itself all throughout the Soviet era into the beginning of the 1990s. This then explains how during this period, when the Russians demographically dominated Kazakhstan, they were able to set about 3 great projects in the later half of the 20th century that attempted to bend and alter Kazakhstan's very geography for their own benefit, with largely negative consequences into the present day. The first was the Virgin Lands campaign carried out by the Khrushchev administration throughout the 1950s and 60s, which encouraged hundreds of thousands of additional Russians and Ukrainians to migrate to the underutilized agricultural land of northern Kazakhstan, and that was intended to transform it into another major grain-producing region of the Soviet Union like a second Ukraine, which did succeed in establishing Kazakhstan as one of the world's most significant wheat producers that continues to this day. But, in the process, huge tracts of the prairies in northern Kazakhstan were zealously and rapidly overplowed, which resulted in the runaway wind erosion of the region's topsoil from the 1960s through to the present. By the mid-1990s, as a result, after Kazakhstan had gained its independence, about 60% of Kazakhstan's available pasture land was already estimated to be in stages of desertification, significantly reducing the country's ability to conduct agriculture on its inherited arable land. At the same time, the Soviets also tested their very first nuclear weapon here in the Kazakh steppe in 1949. From there, the Soviets established a top-secret, strictly off-limits area in Kazakhstan about the same size as Slovenia that they dubbed the Semipalatinsk test site, or the Polygon. It was this location that became the Soviet Union's primary testing ground for nuclear weapons for decades. And across 40 years of history from 1949 until 1989, the Soviets detonated no less than 456 nuclear bombs within this small Slovenia-sized territory in Kazakhstan, roughly a quarter of all nuclear explosions that have ever taken place in Earth's history, which also makes the Semipalatinsk test site the most heavily nuked location anywhere in the world. The constant and heavy nuclear weapons testing in the area was carried out with little regard for the long-term ecological or health consequences that would persist in the area for generations afterward, while the full impact of radiation exposure was concealed by the Soviets for decades, until after the country's collapse in the 1990s. Later, Kazakh experts have estimated that roughly 1.5 million people in Kazakhstan were directly exposed to nuclear fallout over the 40-year period of nuclear testing that was performed in the area. And all of that was somehow still not even the greatest ecological disaster that the Soviets left behind in the independent nation of Kazakhstan to deal with in 1991. Once upon a time, before it started shrinking in the 1960s, the Aral Sea stretched across the modern territory of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan as the third largest lake in the entire world. The sea's huge surface area was about the same size as West Virginia, and its water levels were primarily fed by the two primary rivers of Central Asia that begin with the glaciers and snowmelt high up in the Tian Shan Mountains of modern-day Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. For a variety of reasons in the 1960s, the Soviet authorities decided to transform the Aral Sea surrounding desert environment in Uzbekistan into a massive new agricultural project for growing cotton. And in order to acquire the irrigation necessary for that project, the Soviets dug out a network of canals to divert water from the Amudarya and Sirdarya rivers to water their new cotton fields in Uzbekistan. But by doing so, the Soviets also deprived the Aral Sea of its primary water supply that the rivers brought to it. And in the arid desert with high evaporation and little rainfall to compensate, the Aral Sea began rapidly shrinking and dying by the 1960s. Within 40 years by 2007, the Aral Sea had shrunk from its original size by more than 90%. And with the water continually evaporating away and the salt remaining behind, everything that remained of the Aral Sea continued growing saltier and saltier with time as it shrank to the point where in 2004, the remnants of the Aral Sea were roughly 3 times saltier than the ocean. This quickly led to many catastrophic ecological consequences that have cursed Kazakhstan's geography ever since. First, as the Aral Sea shrank and grew increasingly saltier, it devastated the entire region's once prosperous fishing economy. The commercial fishing catch in the Aral Sea went from 43,000 tons in 1960 to literally zero within only 20 years by 1980, as virtually all of the fish in the sea died with the increasing salinity levels. And as the sea continued shrinking, once prosperous maritime ports were left stranded and landlocked dozens of kilometers away from the new shoreline. The dramatic reduction in water inflows through the Amudarya and Sirdarya rivers correspondingly resulted in a further dramatic reduction in the area's groundwater levels, which dried out the region's subsoils and killed massive amounts of vegetation along the river's former banks. This all contributed to the increasing pace of soil erosion in the Aral Sea region, and the transformation of the sea's former area into a new desert where there used to exist water. As the soil eroded away and the land desertified, the soil's quality and fertility eroded along with it, which led the Soviet authorities to introduce massive amounts of fertilizer to their cotton fields in Uzbekistan to keep up their production, but which only further destroyed the soil's quality in the long term and sent their polluted runoff further downstream to the still crashing Aral Sea. As the Aral Sea continued to shrink, it increasingly left behind salt and these poisonous pesticides on the new desert floor, that then got kicked up into massive new dust storms that carried the high levels of salt and pesticides across the rest of Central Asia, dumping the salt and the pesticides across the new cotton fields and killing them, which led the Soviets to introduce even more fertilizers and pesticides and led them to withdrawing even more water from the rivers to flush the salt out, which compounded the root problem even further. The existence of the Aral Sea's huge body of water here in the middle of Eurasia used to disrupt the power of the cold northerly winds that blew down into the area from Siberia during the winter, while it also helped to cool the area down during the summer, which helped greatly to moderate the region's climate all throughout the year. As a result, the Aral Sea's destruction has led to shorter and hotter summers, longer and colder winters, salty, poisonous dust storms, and dramatically reduced rainfall in western Kazakhstan than ever experienced beforehand. And perhaps even worse, the water that used to exist in the Aral Sea used to get itself evaporated and then redeposited in the Tian Shan Mountains as snowfall, which in turn fed the glaciers and the very rivers that fed the Aral Sea in the first place in a sort of environmental equilibrium. The Soviet diversion of the Amudarya and Surdarya rivers for the cotton fields in Uzbekistan that led to the Aral Sea's destruction further led to a rapid decrease in the snowfall levels happening in the Tian Shan Mountains, while the new dust storms kicked up by the northerly winds blowing in from Siberia brought the former lake bed's dust and salt to the glaciers in the Tian Shan Mountains instead, which has steadily coated the glaciers here in a thick layer of dust, which has rapidly increased the rate at which these glaciers are melting to the point where it's currently estimated that the Tian Shan's glaciers are melting 12 times faster today than they were before the Soviet cotton experiment began. Which ultimately means that once the glaciers are completely gone, the Syr-Darya and Amudarya rivers will have their own primary water sources destroyed, and Kazakhstan's renewable water supplies will be irrevocably damaged for the worse. As noted previously, Kazakhstan's population density today largely follows the course of the Syr-Darya River in the country that used to lead into the Aral Sea. And so, if that river begins to dry up in the future because of the long-lasting negative effects of the Soviet destruction of the Aral Sea, it'll only present even more challenges to Kazakhstan's environment and ability to hold more people. When the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed in 1991 and left Kazakhstan as a suddenly independent nation after a century, it was left behind with a decades-long legacy of Soviet and Russian meddling with both their geography and their demography. They were left with the most heavily nuked location on the planet. Their biggest lake was destroyed and in a state of terminal decline. They were faced with a rapid desertification of the Aral Sea's former lake bed, while their northern agricultural lands had been overexploited and overplowed by the Soviets and were also facing increased desertification rates, while increased dust storms carried salt and toxic particles across the rest of their arable land and ruined even more of their agricultural potential, and they also faced a drying up primary river in the Syr-Darya as a result of the Tian Shan Mountains rapidly melting glaciers that feed the river. At the same time, upon independence at the end of 1991, Kazakhstan was a state with about 6.2 million ethnic Russians who suddenly found themselves in a foreign country outside of Russia proper. In addition to around 900,000 more ethnic Ukrainians, about 960,000 more ethnic Germans, and another 323,000 ethnic Tatars as a result of the decades of Soviet population transfer policies. Ethnic Kazakhs themselves still only made up about 40% of the new country's population at independence. This was a state that was widely expected to fail at the time. And then in the years that followed after the end of the Cold War and the end of authoritarian policies from Moscow, many of these disparate ethnic groups remaining in Kazakhstan quickly began leaving the country in a mass population exodus back to their respective ancestral motherlands. Within only a few years of Kazakhstan's independence by 1999, the ethnic Russian population in the country decreased by a whopping 1.75 million people, as millions of them simply began returning back to Russia proper. For a time, the newly reunified Germany after 1990 allowed the Kazakh Germans to freely relocate to Germany and acquire German citizenship based on the country's old law of return, which rapidly led to hundreds of thousands of the ethnic Germans in Kazakhstan accepting the offer and leaving for Germany. The law ultimately proved quite controversial in Germany, however, as virtually none of the Kazakh Germans even spoke German as a language, and they and their ancestors, the Volga Germans, had lived within the Russian and Soviet system for centuries and were effectively fully Russified Germans culturally and linguistically. Many of them simply struggled to adapt to the new German society they were completely unfamiliar with after arriving, which led to Germany steadily altering and effectively shutting the program down after a long enough time. And at the same time, hundreds of thousands of Kazakhstan's Ukrainians migrated out towards Ukraine, while hundreds of thousands of Kazakhstan's Tatars also migrated out towards Crimea. And at the same time as literally millions of people were leaving Kazakhstan in the 1990s, the country's birth rates also crashed down to their lowest ever recorded levels of modern times in a trend that initially closely followed the parallel crashing birth rates in other post-Soviet states like Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. As Kazakhstan's economy struggled to quickly adapt from the communist-era command-style economy that had permeated for decades into a new capitalist open market economy, the country's GDP and GDP per capita both began declining. Inflation notched upwards, and Kazakh society grew wary of having children under such circumstances. As a result, the country's birth rate plummeted to become one of the lowest in the entire world by 1999 and 2000, with an average nationwide rate of just 1.8 children per woman in those years, down significantly from the 2.84 children per woman in Kazakhstan right before the Soviet collapse in 1989. But there was a very notable and sharp divergence in the fertility rates in Kazakhstan that happened between the country's two primary ethnic groups, Kazakhs and Russians. In 1999, the same year that Kazakhstan's nationwide fertility rate bottomed out at an average of 1.8 children per woman, Kazakh women in the country were still having an average of 2.5 children each, while Russian women were only having 1.38 children each. Ultimately, as a result, the Kazakhstan of the 1990s was hit with a demographic double whammy that particularly affected the country's non-Kazakh ethnic groups, as millions of Russians, Ukrainians, and Germans left the country, with the birth rates of the Russians who remained in the country plummeted to well below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman. In 1993, Kazakhstan reached what was then its all-time high peak population of about 17 million people, and thereafter, it began losing people every single year for about the next decade until 2002. By then in 2002, the country had lost more than 2.1 million residents due to outward migration and falling birth rates, representing a total population loss of about 12.3% of the people that existed in Kazakhstan before the decline set in 1993. This even further represented the fourth and most recent population crash of greater than 10% of residents that Kazakhstan has suffered only in the past century of history. Going back to the period from 1916 to 1923, when Kazakhstan lost 10 to 19% of its population, the Great Famine period from 1930 to 1933, in which another up to 42% of the population was lost, the Second World War from 1941 to 1945, in which yet another 10.6% of the population was lost, and then the Great Migration and economic collapse of 1993 to 2002, in which still another 12.3% of the population was lost yet again. After Kazakhstan's modern population bottomed out in 2002, the country's population density also shrank to a modern low of just 5.47 people per square kilometer then. And it would take Kazakhstan roughly 20 years to recover the population loss it suffered throughout the 1990s. The country's peak population of 17 million people in 1993 wouldn't be seen again all the way until 2013. But since then, Kazakhstan's population has finally started growing once again. Upon gaining independence in 1991, Kazakhstan quickly came under the authoritarian rule of a man named Nursultan Nazarbayev, who would go on to lead Kazakhstan for nearly 3 decades until 2019. And during those decades in power, Nazarbayev would help alter Kazakhstan's internal demography even further. He adopted several economic policies to encourage ethnic Kazakhs and their descendants in the diaspora who had left the country during the 20th century to return back to Kazakhstan. And his government heavily encouraged them to mostly settle in the north of Kazakhstan, where the ethnic Russian population in Kazakhstan also happened to be largely concentrated. Today in the 2020s, this policy has led to around 1 million ethnic Kazakhs who were born outside of Kazakhstan to have returned back to the country, where they now represent about 6% of the country's overall population. And at the same time as these policies were being advanced, Kazakhstan's economy began rapidly recovering in the 2000s, thanks to the opening up of the country's oil and uranium industries to the outside world. Kazakhstan has always been rich in natural resources, but throughout the Soviet era, outside investment in the country was closed. That all changed after Kazakhstan's sudden independence, and major foreign energy and mining companies all began sinking tens of billions of dollars worth of investment into getting the country's abundant resources out of the ground and largely transported to the West. In 2000, a consortium of Western energy companies and the state-owned Kazakh oil company suddenly made a massive discovery within Kazakhstan's section of the northern Caspian Sea. Dubbed Kashagan, they discovered what is still to date the single largest oil field ever found in the world in the past 30 years. Kashagan alone is estimated to contain 13 billion barrels of recoverable crude oil reserves, which is more oil than in the entirety of Algeria, a major OPEC member state. Within only 12 years of Kashagan's discovery by 2012, companies and governments from all around the world had already sunk a whopping $116 billion into developing it, which made it the most expensive energy megaproject anywhere in the world. It became central to the transformation of Kazakhstan throughout the 2000s and 2010s into a major oil player, as pipelines were constructed leading out from Kazakhstan's Caspian oil fields that connected them directly to China and to the Russian port of Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, where Kazakh oil could then be loaded up onto tankers and transported out to global markets. By 2023, Kazakhstan had transformed into the 12th largest producer of oil in the entire world, with a production level that's roughly equivalent to those of Norway and Mexico, while Kazakhstan even further ascended to become the world's 11th largest oil exporter, an ability that enabled Kazakhstan to export more than $35 billion worth of oil in 2022 alone. In the 30 years of history between Kazakhstan's independence in 1991 and 2021, more than $370 billion worth of direct foreign investment poured into the country, with the vast majority of all of it being invested into developing the country's Caspian oil fields and pipelines. And as the global price of oil began rising in the 2000s, Kazakhstan's economy began rapidly growing along with them. Already by 2006, Kazakhstan's oil industry had catapulted the country into making up about 60% of Central Asia's entire combined GDP. And as the country's economy and GDP per capita recovered and grew, so too did the country's ability to attract even more Kazakhs from abroad grow. And so too did the country's fertility rate begin to recover and grow as well. Kazakhstan is a rather unique case study in modern demographic theory, because it's a very rare example of a nation in the contemporary world whose birth rate plummeted to being one of the lowest in the world by 2000, but then rapidly recovered to become one of the highest in the world only 2 decades later by 2021. As ethnic Kazakh fertility rates in the country rose alongside the growing economy and GDP per capita to become more than 3.3 children per woman, reaching a fertility rate in the country today that hasn't been seen in Kazakhstan since the mid-1970s, a half a century ago. This has ultimately led to a very interesting population pyramid pattern forming in Kazakhstan today, where there's a very significant shortage of people in the country today between the ages of 18 and 32, lining up with a crash in the country's fertility rates back in the 1990s and 2000s when births were significantly lower, but where there is also a huge incoming population boom in children in the country aged about 15 and younger, lining up with the rapid increase in fertility rates that have happened in Kazakhstan since the mid-2000s. This makes Kazakhstan, on average, one of the youngest countries in the world today, with 40% of its population being under the age of 25, a notable outlier in most of the former Soviet world. And with fertility rates in the country still high in 2024, the population and therefore the density of Kazakhstan is likely to continue increasing throughout the rest of the 21st century, so it might not seem as empty of a place as it used to very soon. Kazakhstan's population recently surpassed 20 million people for the first time in its history, and the country's density has already increased significantly from about 5.46 people per square kilometer in 2002 to about 7.4 people per square kilometer today, only 2 decades later. And based on the UN's projections of Kazakhstan's population climbing further to about 24 million people by 2050, the country's population density will likely also climb up to about 8.8 people per square kilometer by then, which by that point will surpass the density of people seen in countries like Russia and the Central African Republic today. Kazakhstan's overall lack of population density is, therefore, in my opinion, more a matter of history and the long-lasting effects of Soviet and Russian colonization on the country than anything else. But while the population in Kazakhstan is growing overall, it's not growing evenly among the country's two primary ethnic groups. As the fertility rates among ethnic Kazakh women in the country have grown dramatically since 2000, the fertility rate of ethnic Russians in the country has remained stagnant and well below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman for decades now. As more Russians have left the country for Russia and fewer births have been recorded at the same time as more Kazakhs have moved into the country and more Kazakh children have been born, the Russian population in Kazakhstan has steadily declined since its highs under the Soviet period. Today, in the 2020s, ethnic Russians only represent about 15% of Kazakhstan's total population, and they're largely concentrated in a belt across the north of the country near the border with Russia, and near the old geographic frontier between the Eurasian steppe and the Siberian forest. There are only about 3 million ethnic Russians who live in Kazakhstan now, fewer than half the number that used to live in Kazakhstan back in 1989, just before the Soviet Union's collapse. But demographic dangers continue to exist for Kazakhstan, and the long legacy of Soviet and Russian influence on their society have not yet fully gone away either. Putin's Russia has made it painfully clear that they have no qualms with invading and conquering territory in the 21st century that is inhabited by large numbers of ethnic Russians, as has been evidenced by Russia's seizure of Crimea in 2014 and ongoing full-scale invasion of all of Ukraine since 2022. Outside of the estimated 8 million ethnic Russians in Ukraine who mostly live in the southern and eastern territories of that country, that Russia is actively attempting to conquer through military force right now, the next largest population of ethnic Russians outside of Russia today are the 3 million of them concentrated in northern Kazakhstan, a part of the country that many Russian nationalists have long asserted should one day return back to the control of Moscow. When Vladimir Putin himself visited Kazakhstan in August of 2014, merely months after he led Russia's seizure and annexation of Crimea, Putin made a backhanded compliment of Kazakhstan's then leader Nursultan Nazarbayev when he said, verbatim, he created a state in a territory that had never had a state before. The Kazakhs never had any statehood. He created it. Essentially implying in the process that Kazakhstan's mere existence as an independent state was a gift from Russia. Later on, in August of 2022, months after the Russian army had launched its all-out invasion of Ukraine, Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, who had served as the nation's leader between 2008 and 2012, saw a long, rambling post made to his VKontakte account, basically Russia's version of Facebook, that once again openly called into question Kazakhstan's very statehood. Medvedev's account wrote in the post that it was the Russians who had built the first permanent settlements on the, quote, wild lands of northern Kazakhstan across the 17th and 18th centuries, and that the Russians had spent more than 300 years settling and colonizing these lands, and that before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, 62.5% of northern Kazakhstan was inhabited by ethnic Slavs rather than by Kazakhs. The post stated that Kazakhstan's policies of resettling ethnic Kazakhs in these northern lands constituted a genocide of the Russian people there. It asserted that Kazakhstan was nothing but an artificial state, much like how Putin currently labels Ukraine. And it went even further by asserting that northern cities in Kazakhstan like Guryev, Semipalatinsk, and Verny in northern Kazakhstan were all former Russian territories. The post was later deleted, and Medvedev himself has since asserted that it was created by hackers who managed to break into his account. But either way, Medvedev's and Putin's public comments about Kazakhstan's sovereignty, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the presence of millions of ethnic Russians who remain in Kazakhstan have long unnerved people in Kazakhstan that they haven't fully escaped from the long shadow of Moscow just yet. When discounting the 3 million ethnic Russians in the country, Kazakhstan's remaining population is only about 17 million people landlocked in the center of Eurasia and full of massive resources like oil and uranium, puny in comparison to Russia's population. Kazakhstan therefore has little choice but to continue playing Moscow's games and toe the Kremlin line as much as it can, lest it face a similar dismemberment of their territory the same way that other post-Soviet states who strayed too far out of Russia's orbit experienced, like Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. Moreover, about 80% of Kazakhstan's oil export capacity runs through pipelines that run through Russia first to the Russian Black Sea coast, which increases Kazakhstan's economic dependence upon Russia as well. Kazakhstan will therefore probably continue trying to dilute the Russian population in the north of their country as much as physically possible by resettling more and more ethnic Kazakhs there, while the country will simultaneously attempt to continue pleasing Moscow by remaining within Russia's Eurasian Economic Union and CSTO military alliance. That'll occasionally include calling upon the Kremlin for military assistance, as they did in January of 2022, when they requested Russian troops be deployed into Kazakhstan to put down a series of anti-government protests that had erupted there. At the same time, Kazakhstan will also try to continue selling its massive resources of oil, uranium, and wheat to a Western world that now largely boycotts Russia's resources. Kazakhstan toes a dangerous line between Moscow and the West right now as a result. A dangerous sort of neutrality. If Kazakhstan strays too far into Moscow's orbit, then Kazakhstan could be slapped with devastating Western financial sanctions the same way that Russia and Belarus already have been, which could lead to a collapse in Kazakhstan's oil and resource-based economy and destroy their decades of economic and demographic progress. But if they stray too far into the West's orbit by leaving Russian-led organizations like the CSTO, then Kazakhstan could end up facing the wrath of Russian nationalists, and Medvedev's 2022 threats could turn into reality. And Kazakhstan could suddenly face territorial dismemberment and the conquest of their northern lands into Russia, the same way that Ukraine and Georgia have already experienced things, which could cost Kazakhstan their most valuable wheat-producing regions, much of their uranium ore sites, and potentially even their huge oil fields around the northern Caspian Sea, which would also devastate their economy and threaten their demography yet again. Kazakhstan has to continue playing their cards delicately in a dangerous neighborhood, lest they face another Russian-induced demographic catastrophe like they did all across the 20th century that undoes all of the tremendous progress they've made so far in the 21st century. Now, as a public figure who often makes videos here on YouTube about pretty controversial subjects, I used to have a big issue with data privacy. And I don't know about you, but I've also noticed a huge increase recently in the volume of spam calls and emails that I've been getting. That is, until I started using this video's sponsor, Incogni. You see, the reason the spam calls and emails have been getting worse recently is because of a thing called data brokers. These are private companies that collect and then sell your personal data that they scrape from publicly available records like electoral rolls and census reports. And there are hundreds of these kinds of data broker companies probably selling your personal information right now. These companies could have your name, phone number, address, shopping habits, and possibly even your social security number that's available to the highest bidder. I know that when I checked myself, there were literally hundreds of different companies that had this kind of information up for sale to other companies, scammers, stalkers, or worse. At best, this situation leads to scam calls and spam email, and at worst, it can lead to doxing or even identity theft. Data breaches are getting more and more common every year, and especially if you live in the United States, you straight up don't have any federal protection for these kinds of companies whatsoever. But this is where Incogni comes in to help. Incogni will fight on your behalf to remove your personal data from data brokers, and they'll deal with any objections from their side. All you've got to do is create an account and give them your approval to work on your behalf. Incogni will then carry out repeated ongoing removals, because even if the broker removes your data once, they can always just collect it and sell it again. Incogni will repeatedly fight to make sure that your personal information stays off of the market permanently. I know that when I signed up, it was horrifying to see how many brokers out there had my data. And then it was so satisfying seeing Incogni getting them deleted one by one. And I've seen a huge decrease in the number of spam calls and emails that I've gotten ever since. So if you'd like to give Incogni a try as well, you can do so by clicking the button here on your screen right now, or by going to incogni.com/reallifelore, where you can use the code reallifelore to get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. You'll also be greatly helping to support my channel at the same time, so once again, that's incogni.com/reallifelore and code reallifelore for 60% off an annual Incogni plan. And as always, thank you so much for watching.